What's cracking, everybody? It's good to see you again. Hope everyone out there is having an awesome week. Today we're going to talk about what happens to coffee as it ages and answer the question, is fresher coffee always better? Now, it's common street knowledge that the fresher the coffee is, the better, but it's really not quite as simple as that. Once coffee's roasted, you've got two forces that are working in opposition to each other that are going to determine coffee's peak freshness. Those two things are degassing and oxidation. Degassing is the release of CO2 in freshly roasted coffee, and degassing happens at a particularly aggressive rate during that first week after which coffee is roasted. CO2 can be a problem for a couple of reasons. The first is that during that first week after roasting, because the coffee's driving off gas at such an aggressive rate, the coffee isn't really settled and it's almost like this living, breathing thing. It's far from inert. And what this does is it lends itself to uneven and unpredictable extractions. Any barista who's made espresso with really fresh coffee several days in a row has experienced this effect. Even if you have a standard recipe, you're kind of chasing the dragon with the grind setting. Day 2 is so much different than day 3. Day 3 is so much different than day 4, and it's really tricky to dial these coffees in. The second thing that makes CO2 a problem is the taste or flavor that's associated with it. In really fresh coffee, that CO2 can mask some of the characteristics that make coffee special. You won't have as much clarity of flavor, you won't have as developed sweetness, and the whole experience will have this kind of sharp and edgy vibe to it. So for the first several days off roast, coffee really isn't at its peak freshness or peak flavor yet. So we need to let the coffee rest for a while before we use it. So how long do we let it rest? Well, to figure that out, we need to talk about oxidation. Oxidation in roasted coffee starts as soon as the coffee comes out of the roaster. Now, oxidation is the same thing that makes metal rust, it's the same thing that makes food go rotten if you leave it out, and it's the thing that makes coffee taste stale. So if you haven't guessed by now, oxidation is bad. Now, oxidation can be sped up and slowed down in several ways. You can slow down oxidation by storing your roasted coffee in a sealed bag with a one-way valve on it. That's that little valve that pretty much every coffee bag has on it. That valve allows CO2 to move out of the bag to allow the coffee to degas, but doesn't let oxygen in the bag to keep the coffee from oxidizing. Grinding your coffee increases the rate of oxidation because you're exposing more of that bean's surface area to oxygen. This is why, assuming you have a good grinder, it's preferable to get whole bean coffee when you buy it and not ground. So we've got degassing on one side of the equation, oxidation on the other side of the equation. What does this mean for coffee's optimum freshness? Basically, we end up with a bell curve that illustrates coffee's peak freshness. For the first few days off roast, you want to let the coffee rest and degas, and you don't want to touch the coffee. The coffee's not ready to be brewed yet. For our coffees, that's generally 0 to 5 days off roast. We try not to use anything before day 6. The coffee's just not ready. After the initial degassing has taken place, but before excessive oxidation sets in, now you're in the sweet spot. Now you're in that optimum window for making things that are incredibly delicious, brewing in a predictable way, getting even extractions. The coffee should be sweet. You should be able to taste the nuance. You'll get good clarity of flavor. This is where coffee is prime time. For our coffees, this range is that 6 to 14 day window. Now, it's worth noting that this window is much wider than most people give it credit for. Most people think that there's a few days where your coffee's really good, and outside of that, it's basically bad, and that's just not true. If you keep your coffee in a sealed bag, keep it in a cool, dry place, your coffee should be at peak freshness for as long as it takes you to go through that 12-ounce bag. Unless, of course, you only drink 1 cup of coffee every 3 or 4 days, in which case, you need to drink more coffee. What are you doing? In that 15 to 30 day window, the effects of oxidation start to become more apparent, but it's not like the coffee instantly goes bad. What you'll experience here is much less nuance. Some of the varietal characteristics and the things that make the coffees really special and intricate will start to fade. The coffee will be a little less lively, lower overall sweetness level. It still won't taste bad, but it'll tend to taste boring and just like a cup of coffee. After 30 days, the effects of oxidation really start to settle in. The coffee will taste flat and cardboardy, papery. You'll begin to notice those stale flavors a lot more. At this point, you should probably donate your coffee to someone that you don't really like that much. So in a nutshell, your coffee aging map looks something like this. Now, different factors can affect this aging map as well. For example, darker roasted coffees oxidize more quickly than lighter roasted coffees, so their peak freshness window might fall off a little bit more quickly. If you get into really, really dark roasted coffees, even though they oxidize much more quickly, you might not notice this effect that much at all because all you're tasting in the cup is roast and carbon. And since you never really had any varietal characteristic in there from the get-go because it was all roasted out, you don't actually notice the aging that much. This is one of the reasons that that can of Folgers that you had tastes pretty much the same as it did 3 months ago. So with all that, we can conclude that for optimum brewing and the most delicious coffee possible, fresher isn't always better. You wanna let your coffee age enough to drive off some of that CO2, but not let it age so far that it starts to oxidize and go stale. Hope that's useful for y'all. Thank you so much for watching. If you're feeling the vibes, you might as well hit me with a like. If you're feeling them on a deeper level, you might as well hit me with a subscribe. If you do those things, I might be just the most psyched person on the face of the planet. Stay dialed, y'all, and I will catch you on the flip side. Peace.